the Nicktoon Animation Studio in Hollywood. Hollywood.
Hello everyone, this is Patricia, and we have two very special guests discussing about what the legacy of the Nicktoons was in the form of entertainment. So, why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
Great, I'm Casey. I'm a co-host of the Friday Night Nicktoons podcast.
And I'm Ashli, the other co-host of the Friday Night Nicktoons podcast.
And how long have you guys been doing the podcast for?
We just did episode 14?
13, so 13 weeks now.
Okay, so you guys have been doing it for a couple of months. All right, so the reason why I have you guys here is because you guys discuss about various Nicktoons in a very unique way, in which you have 3 episodes of 3 different Nicktoons, and you guys discuss about it in a sense in which it has a certain theme, in which it discusses about like what kind of morals and entertainment value it has. So, what would you say is your earliest memory of watching one of the Nicktoons?
God, that's hard to remember. To be honest, I don't remember a time when I didn't watch Nicktoons. I think Rugrats is the first one that I remember consistently watching, but pretty much my entire childhood was pretty surrounded by Nicktoons. I remember them always being on. Nickelodeon was always a big show or channel that was on in our lives. So I'd say more or less my entire life. I mean, they pre-exist me, you know?
Right. I mean, they pre-exist a lot of people since it started in 1979. So it's pretty much been around for a long time. How about you, Casey?
Well, I have a pretty specific memory, and it's a little later than a lot of the shows we've talked about on the show. I had to go back and re-educate a little bit. But we had just gotten cable for the first time. I was in like 2nd or 3rd grade, so like early 2000s. And we flip on the TV and immediately find Nickelodeon because all our friends watch it. And the SpongeBob theme is on. We just happened to come on it right as the Are You Ready Kids was on. We got so excited. It was the Suds episode, and I still have a fond memory of that episode because it really was the first Nicktoon I ever watched.
Okay, great. Now, when it comes to, like, gathering a whole bunch of kids to watching the Nicktoons, why do you think the Nicktoons had that kind of presence to a whole bunch of kids? Because, you know, regardless of what TV show it was, it seemed to have, like, a massive impact on them. So what do you think made the original Nicktoons that unique?
I think it was the overlap of a lot of things. I think the Disney Renaissance really helped in the early 90s of just getting kids. Not that kids have always loved animation, but this sort of tailored marketing towards younger generations, and it was colorful. There were songs, and I think Nick kind of evolved around that same time. And the shows, I mean, not all of them have lasted to this day in terms of our memories of them, but I think the shows had strong hooks that were simple and easy for kids to latch onto, and there was a ton of variety, so there was something for everyone.
Branching out of that, something that I think comes up a lot in our show too is just the way that the Nicktoons they're kid oriented, but they're not childish. They have topics that are geared towards children, but it doesn't feel like they're not taking children seriously. And I feel like that was part of the reason that I really liked them, was that they didn't feel like they were dumbed down or like they were making them like too simple for us. And that's part of why I really enjoyed them.
All right. And another question that I have is that, out of all the Nicktoons, you know, when it came to, like, certain categories, whether it be a funny one or a serious one or one that had everything in between, in your, like, personal childhood, which one was the one that you seem to remember that everyone was getting the most excited over?
For me, I would say I feel like SpongeBob was the one that stuck out the most. It was the one that was, like, the most of a phenomenon. I remember everybody was watching it all the time. Everybody would talk about, even when there was like new episodes coming out, I would talk about it with kids at school. When the movie came out, that was a huge deal. Like, everyone was getting pumped up about it. It was the one that I would say was most distinctly mentioned outside of just watching it, for me at least.
Yeah, I think Fairly Odd Parents was a pretty big phenomenon. I was going to say SpongeBob too, but actually you covered that. I think Fairly Odd Parents rivaled it, but was never quite there. I would get excited about all the movies that they did that were straight to TV, and it seemed like they had new episodes coming out constantly.
Now, how do you feel about how your generation was treated with the Nicktoons? Like, from the podcast that I listened to, you guys talk about, for the most part, late 90s to early 2000s Nicktoons. How do you feel that your generation felt about Nickelodeon compared to the previous generation, or even better yet, maybe to the generation that came after you?
Yeah, sure. We do tend to focus mostly, like you said, early 90s, or late 90s, early thousands. And it's hard for me to say exactly how the generation after us was, but I feel like for us, I feel like there was more of an attachment to the Nicktoons than there is now, and I could be wrong on that, but that's sort of the vibe I get, is that it felt more of a part of our lives and our media than it is currently, but that's just, again, I don't know for a fact on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think I'll speak to the generation before us. I can't know since I was too young or not alive then, but it seemed like the early 90s had a similar feel. I think they got sillier as it went on, and not in an immature necessarily way, but I think it became more accessible, whereas the early Nicktoons are a little more advanced. It seemed like they weren't aimed at little kids.
Now, I know you guys don't really talk about this on your podcast, but how do you feel about more of the live-action shows that came out during this time?
I was big into the Amanda Show, for one. All that I feel like I definitely watched, but I just remember loving the Amanda Show. The Amanda Show was like one of my introductions to like a live comedy bit kind of a show, and I was pretty obsessive, personally. I remember I would go on like theamandashow.com, had fun things and stuff.
Yeah, I loved the Amanda Show. It was definitely my first time being exposed to anything like that, and I thought they were all so talented, and they were so young and great. And then I watched some Keenan and Kel and really enjoyed it, and all that as well. But Amanda Show, I feel like, paved the way for Drake and Josh, which was definitely a staple of my life, starting to get into the older childhood, like late elementary school. I thought that show was really great.
Mm-hmm. And not to mention about all the other stuff that came afterwards, like all the little after-school segments like You Pick Live and Slime Time Live.
Yeah, I'm a little bummed I never got to, be on Slime Time Live, get slimed on, but definitely that was a big part of, that was a big part of my childhood, Nickelodeon in general, but yeah, the live actions, I haven't actually thought about those a lot recently.
The whole Nick takes over your school thing, do you remember that?
Yes, exactly. There's that, and there's also the earlier 2000s when they had the Kids' Choice Awards, and they had all the different awards that they don't even do nowadays. Like, they used to have a burp award, and there was a lot of... and also, a lot, they, all that would branch out into a whole bunch of other shows, similar to the way the Amanda Show was a branch out from all that, and then there was a lot of experimentation with live-action shows. Like, some of them worked out, like Drake and Josh. Others, such as the Nick Cannon Show, didn't exactly work out. But, I guess for the most part, it was a lot of experimentation, a lot of branching out, which... I guess in your, kind of sense, there was a bit of variety, especially with the entertainment of what Nickelodeon brought in. Now, a lot of people say that, the 2000s aren't as good as what the 90s brought in. And, how do you feel about that? Do you ever get that every once in a while when you ever have that post in which, your decade wasn't as good as the decade that I grew up with or something like that?
Yeah, you certainly see that. Like, the only 90s kids will understand. And I think there are certain shows that I don't like as much in the ways that they've grown over time, but I think part of that is just my personal attachment. But I think it's just common for a lot of people. They grow up with it, right? It's part of your childhood, so you're more attached to that show, and you feel like it's better because it has that nostalgia factor that you don't get anymore when you're watching the newer shows.
Right. There are plenty of great shows from that time, too. Like, we've been finding some hidden stuff. We did a One Season Wonders episode, and we watched episodes of Cat Scratch and the X's and really loved both of those. As Told by Ginger is actually started in 2000, and we've really been getting into that lately, too.
Oh, yeah. I did an entire month of that on my YouTube channel.
Nice. Yeah,
check that out. We like forgot about that show entirely. It's a good one.
Yeah, a lot of
Okay.
people seem to have forgotten about that one. And I guess, for the most part, it is understandable. And I even did an entire video on why I felt why, as told by Ginger, in my personal opinion, was a groundbreaking yet overlooked Nicktoon. I stated that my personal opinion on why was that the year 2000 wasn't the best year for Nickelodeon. In fact, I thought it was a horrible year because, in my personal opinion, every single show that came out in 2000 was either forgotten or nobody at the time really liked. Like, the shows that came out in 2000 were Double Dare 2000, Caitlin's Way, Pelswick, The Brothers Garcia, and No One Knows Best, and of course, as told by Ginger, and the movies. I mean, the only thing that I still remember that people still talk about with 2000 is Rugrats in Paris, but nobody seems to talk about Snow Day. So yeah, I mean, 2001 was a much better year because it had The Fairly Odd Parents and Invader Zim, and then it continued on. I think that the reason why was because Nickelodeon felt that they needed to get into the new millennium because 2000, big number, big event, something like that. So, that's why, that's one of the reasons why I felt. So, yeah, I mean, I guess for the most part, for the new millennium, Nickelodeon had to branch themselves out to do something more creative for the new generation who grew up with the shows, like cater to the kids and the teenagers. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but I think for the most part, as time went on, especially like in the later run for the 2000s, the earlier run for the 2000s, it did really gravitate toward a lot of people. I mean, sometimes I even said, man, I wish I was a kid when these shows came out, because in 2000, I was already in high school.
Yeah, we're on the younger end of that. Definitely was around when those shows were becoming big, and I loved them for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some of those ones you mentioned, I mean, I remember all the names you listed, but some of them were just back of the memory vault.
Oh yeah, but the 2000s ones were definitely more so, like you said, more obscure for whatever reason. Definitely an interesting thing to think about. I don't know, we don't get so much into the analysis of the overall ways the show branches, but...
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, sometimes for the most part, there's always like these little nuggets that you always find, even with a big thing like Nickelodeon. You always find something new, especially with a program that's forgotten, like, The X's or Cat Scratch or El Tigre or something like that. So it's always nice to discover something. And, I'm sure that, it's kind of like one of those cases in which, the popular shows are the ones that are taking over, but then, it's wonderful that you get to step back and you get to find something like that. I mean, especially in our day and age when everything is in the internet, as opposed to like, did you have it recorded on VHS tape or something? So, yeah, it's nice.
It's funny that you mentioned Rugrats in Paris, because that's actually our theme of this week. We're doing our first movie on our podcast, and it'll be fun, because I remember it being great as a kid, but I'm not sure how well it'll hold up.
I remember seeing it in theaters as a kid. Like you said, it was a big, exciting moment when that one was coming out.
Yeah, I mean, it was Rugrats in the movie theater. It doesn't get much better than that.
Right, exactly. And, it's funny because, both of the Rugrats movies, like the first one, the Rugrats movie where they introduced Baby Dill, I mean, that was such a huge phenomenon when that came out. It was the first animated movie that was not done by Disney to make $100 million. And that was when, a lot of people thought that, movies based off of Nicktoons, can it happen? Because previously we had Harriet the Spy and Good Burger, and those turned out pretty okay. So Rugrats was like the thing that was like saying, you know what, let's see if we can do it, and it turned out great. And yeah, you guys are gonna enjoy Rugrats in Paris. It still holds up, and it's, in my opinion, my favorite out of the Rugrats trilogy.
That's good to know.
The first one being pretty sad too. I remember a lot of heavy moments.
Yeah, you guys are gonna have a great time. Trust me. With the Nicktoons that came out during the time, and all the variety that it did have, and all that stuff, I feel that this was kind of like around the time in which Klasky Csupo was becoming like one of the biggest names in animation. They had Rugrats, they had All Real Monsters, Rocket Power, The Wild Thornberrys, as told by Ginger, and then eventually they would have All Grown Up and Rugrats Preschool Days. I mean, today's generation don't really appreciate Klasky Csupo because, sometimes they feel that the animation is not the best looking. Have you ever been have you ever known somebody who was really creeped out by the animation, or you yourself were not too big of a fan of it? Because I remember at the time it was everywhere. Nobody really talked about it, but now people seem to talk about it. What do you guys think?
You know, I feel it with early Rugrats a little bit, where you kind of got that uncanny valley sort of thing going on. And we talked about it on our Rugrats episode a little bit. Like, it's kind of cool because it kind of helps the whole baby theme of the show. And you can tell, you know, where the lines and shapes are and everything. So I kind of like it, but I see it being a little unsettling too.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe, again, part of it is because we grew up with it. So at the time it was sort of the norm and it was what we were used to. So the animation style wasn't quite unsettling to me. I guess that there are things where, like, I'll look at the proportions of the people and they look a little bit strange, but I guess to me it just feels like what I've always seen, you know. It looks, I don't know, it looks like what I'm used to these classic sort of Nicktoons looking at, like. So I could see why, if you didn't grow up with it, it would be more so an issue. Like, you're not used to seeing animation that looks like that. But, you know, for me, it's mostly a positive thing.
Yeah, I think it gives it its unique feel. I mean, to be quite honest, you know, unless it's in context, unless there's a reason for that, I'm not too crazy about it. But I guess I kind of understand because it's a style of choice as opposed to, like, somebody who didn't care about how it looked. Another thing that I feel about with Klasky Csupo is that, you know, at the time, you know, they were like one of the biggest companies ever, and everybody was getting into, like, one of their shows in some way, shape, or form. Do you have any fond memories of any of the Nickelodeon video games that came out at the time?
Not necessarily fond, but I know, and I don't remember what it was called. Here, I'm going to try to do some Google searching. It was a Game Boy Advance game, or maybe even Game Boy Color. It was a SpongeBob game, and I remember the animation was terrible, but I loved it. And I guess, like, I loved it, but I remember my brother would, like, see me playing it, and he was like, why are you playing this terrible game? But I don't remember, there was something about getting, like, a health bar or something. Hold on.
Sure,
but
take your time.
I played that game pretty excessively to my memory, and again, I don't think it was a good game. I would never play it again now. Like, even remembering now, like, I remember getting really frustrated because the controls weren't good and the system wasn't good. But I think it was just because it was SpongeBob. I was willing to allow it to have all of the issues that it did, and I still wanted to play it. I think it might be this one, this SpongeBob Super Sponge or something. I think that was the one. Anyways. So it wasn't necessarily a high-quality video game, but I think because of the character specifically, I let it not be a high-quality game and still enjoyed it.
3 come to mind for me. First is the SpongeBob computer game. I think it was just the SpongeBob movie game for PC. And I remember there was, like, a 2-minute loading screen when you walk between, like, any different rooms, and I loved it. It was, like, probably not the voice actors, but they had, like, cut scenes, and it was kind of funny. The next one that comes to mind, my roommates and I recently pulled out Fairly Odd Parents Break Into Rules, which, awesome. It's not a good game by any means, but we had so much fun playing it. And then the last one, I just remember renting for N64, this Rocket Power game. I don't think it was even a racing game, or a surfing game. I remember skateboarding around, but I don't even know what it was, if it was like a Simpsons hit and run kind of thing, but those are the ones that I remember at least.
Yeah, and any merchandise that you guys have any memories of, like a lot of any of the dolls or any of the toys or maybe t-shirts or anything like that?
The hotel, and we were in a kids-themed room, and they gave us, like, there was, like, notebooks on the desks that were in there, and they had all of the Friday Night Nicktoons on there, and I thought that was so cool. I remember it was, like, Tommy from Rugrats and Eliza Thornberry and SpongeBob, and so I held on to that for ages. It was this, like, tiny little notebook. Other than that, I don't think I had much, like, merchandise. Maybe, like, a SpongeBob beanbag, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't a huge merch person either. I'm pretty sure, because my mom was a teacher, so she would get, like, free books and things. I'm pretty sure I had, like, some SpongeBob books of sorts. SpongeBob was really, like, the main one I remember. I feel like I had, like, some, like, SpongeBob trivia something that might be buried somewhere within the however many books I owned, but I wasn't too much of a collector of their merchandise particularly.
Okay, and just a few more questions. When looking back on the Nicktoons that you guys grew up with, especially when doing this podcast, what were some of the more surprising moments that you were talking about, or when you saw when you looked back on them?
So we talk about this show a lot, and I'm going to try to not overdo it here, but Hey Arnold, the Patakis family and their entire dark dynamic, I totally did just not catch on to as a kid whatsoever. I didn't catch on to the fact that her parents were as awful as they were and that she was as neglected as she was. And that was one of the most striking things to me when rewatching, was just how much more I not identified with her, but I guess empathized with her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel that that's a great example, because looking back on the Patakis, looking back on how the smoothies that Miriam drank was actually a way to say it's alcohol, or Big Bob's temper, or Olga saying that she's all perfect and stuff like that. And yeah, I think in my opinion, it's what made some parts of Hey Arnold the most standoutish compared to a lot of the cartoons that were coming out at the time. Because, I mean, how many TV shows came out in which, you know, it talked about, like, family neglect and family abuse? And I mean, it's a shame that Nickelodeon never picked up the Pataki spin-off series, but yeah, it was something that when looking back on it myself, and I owned the Hey Arnold DVDs, it's like, you know, you get to kind of appreciate Helga. She could have turned out to be like the stereotypical bully, but because of all the episodes focusing on how sadistic her family is, it just really makes you appreciate about who she is, you know?
Totally. And what I love about Hey Arnold is that it takes kids seriously. And I got that even when I was a kid, that it wasn't talking down to you. But I think I learned a lot of important life lessons at like a critical time from that show. But to get back to talk about a different show, As Told by Ginger, I'm realizing is it really accurately captures the middle school experience. And I didn't realize it even when I was living it. How, like, even the theme song is just perfect to that world and that feeling of insecurity. And I think a lot of kids needed to see that show when it came out.
Yeah, they did needed to see that show. It's just a shame that nobody did when it first came out.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I was 14 when the show came out, and I saw it alongside with Caitlin's Way, another very obscure Nickelodeon show that people don't really remember, because similar to As Told by Ginger, was very dramatic in a time in which, for the most part, a lot of Nicktoons were very, like, lighthearted and silly, and they made a lot of jokes and stuff like that. But As Told by Ginger kept it more grounded. And, you know, a lot of the lessons that they taught, everything from divorce, suicidal depression, addiction, romance, and sometimes, you know, it just really, you know, tugs into your heartstrings when you look back on something like that. You know, and, you know, for the most part, I think that, you know, what we were talking about earlier about variety is that, you know, at the time when Nickelodeon was at its, you know, true Renaissance era, or however people call it, golden era, golden age, whatever, it seems to have taken those kids seriously with entertaining them, making sure that they were the kids that they wanted to, you know, showcase about, this is what we can do, this is how we feel that kids should be treated, and not to mention that we want you to enjoy yourself, but at the same time we want you to learn, and we want you to showcase that, you know what, sometimes life is hard, and, you know, you're not alone.
Absolutely. And like we were saying, I wish I watched it more when it was out, because it definitely has a lot of that you're not alone feeling, where you can recognize that, because they're rough times for a lot of kids, and you know it's important to recognize that you're not in it alone. And I think it's so cool that they had a cartoon that was geared towards kids that spoke to that, and it is a shame that it wasn't as popular as it could have been, but the fact that it exists is still really cool to me.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that we can wrap things up, so please, why don't you plug and promote your podcast and where people can find you at?
Go for it, Ashley.
All right, cool. So, again, we're the Friday Night Nicktoons podcast. You can find us over on Twitter at FNN_podcast. We also have a Facebook page, which is also FNN Podcast. And we're active a little bit on Reddit in a few subreddits. So if you want to tweet at us, follow us. We always appreciate it. We have episodes coming out every Friday.
We've got Rugrats in Paris this week, and then next week we'll be talking about back to school episodes, as a lot of people will be heading back. So we're still looking, I think, for exact specifics, but there are a ton of them, so we'll be digging into that.
All right, wonderful. So, Ashli, Casey, thank you so much for guest starring, and continue on with your podcast. You guys are doing an amazing job.
Thank you.
This is great.
And that should be it for this podcast. Tune in next time, as we're going to be discussing about how did the 3 original Nicktoons change pop culture, with 2 very special guests, Custine Gaines and Matthew Clickstein. So, hope to see you guys around soon, and thanks for listening.
Not just cartoons. We're Nicktoons. Not just cartoons.
We're Nicktoons.
Not just cartoons.
We're Nicktoons.
Not just cartoons.